Hi, I'm Carl King. Today, I'm going to walk you through the steps I took to recreate my favorite cue from 1960s Star Trek. It's from an episode called the Corbomite Maneuver, and it was originally composed by Fred Steiner. Now, not many people recognize him, but I think he was the greatest. I had to do all of this by ear since I don't have the notation, which means I had to be okay with an approximation of the original. This cue, called Radiation, is just under a minute long, so it's the perfect length for an exercise like this. I did it entirely in Cubase, only using Vienna Symphonic Library and Mir Pro, which at this point I can't imagine working without. Okay, let's go through my process. The first step was to create what is called a tempo map. You import the original recording into your DAW and then figure out what the tempo is. Cubase has a function to detect the tempo, which works very well for simple stuff. But this piece had a lot of speeding up and slowing down, as it was all conducted back in the day without a click. As you can see, the tempo is all over the place, far more than I would have expected. So, in Cubase, I did this entirely manually. I figured out what the tempo was for the first few beats, and then I sat there and dragged these points up and down for the rest of the cue. This can be tricky because if you change something earlier in the piece, it throws off all the other points that come after it. Step 2, I figured out the basic instrumentation. Which instruments are playing the most important lines? It can help to listen closely many times, over and over, and take notes on what you're hearing. You can make a list of all the instruments you hear when doing this. You can also work the other way around by starting with a list of all the main orchestral instruments, and then listening for them, one by one, section by section, or through the whole piece. Does the oboe do anything here? How about the violas? What about later in the piece? Did that instrument drop out, or is it still doing something? That sort of checklist can help you from overlooking things. On to step 3, I started sketching in my instruments in MIDI. Now, I try to not worry too much about the articulations at first, because that can all be dealt with afterwards. As you're working these details out, your mind can play tricks on you. For instance, for as many times as I listened to this piece, and the 9 hours I spent working on it, I entirely missed the low sustained string note that comes in during this part. And I had to go back and add them in when I thought I was already done. Figuring out a dissonant piece of orchestral music by ear is difficult because at certain dynamics the instruments blend together and some of their timbres become indistinguishable from each other. You can try tricks like using headphones and listening through only one ear at a time. Do a whole pass with only the left ear, then the right ear, then both, and then repeat that whole process. Then listen with the volume way up, then way down, and you'll start to hear things you weren't aware of before. And sometimes you can only deduce what's happening. For instance, I had to take my best guess at what notes that xylophone way in the background was playing. So I filled in what I thought would make sense if I were the composer. Something to notice about this cue, some of the instrumentation doesn't seem to be standard. For instance, the strings are barely there, whereas in most orchestras, the strings are the biggest sections and are used the most. If this were a normal orchestra playing this cue, you'd have 40, 50, 60 people sitting there on payroll not doing anything. It's almost like there's only low strings in this cue once in a while, and that seemed to be typical of these Star Trek scores from that era. I seem to hear maybe just a few cellos and basses, and the majority of the scores are heavy on brass and percussion and woodwinds. The recording I was modeling was done later with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, but still, it was an odd choice. This is just a guess, but maybe during those original Star Trek days they didn't have a full string section, so maybe when they redid these cues they stuck to the original orchestrations. If you happen to know that trivia, by the way, reply in the comments or send me an email, because I would like to know. Another thing, muted brass is central to that old Star Trek sound. The players were really blaring, too. I don't know how their lips survived the ordeal. I added a little bit of high boost for some extra sting. And here's a mystery. On the source recording, I think I could hear some extra trumpets coming in on the left, which I found odd. They could have been positioned in the studio that way, but I don't know. They seem to be coming from where the French horns were usually seated, so not sure what was going on there, if they were panning it. Anyway, I ended up leaving those out. Quick mention of articulation detail. There's key switching galore going on here. When I first started out doing MIDI orchestra stuff, for the first few years, I was super lazy with the articulations and key switching. I thought, just set it as a sus or a stack and move on. Who needs all these other articulations, right? Well, these days I'm getting detailed with it, investing a lot of time, often switching articulations every single note, and it makes a huge difference. Since I program almost everything in one note at a time with a trackpad, it's working well for me. And as always, I sculpt that velocity X fade in fine detail for each note and phrase. And now, the last step. I knew that I wasn't going to copy this piece note for note and get everything 100% right, so I was aiming to represent the spirit of the original. So once I felt it was close enough, I muted and ignored the original for a while. At that point, I just want to make the mock-up sound good as itself. That's going to mean changing some things around. The mix, the positioning of instruments, the reverb, and miraculously, Mir Pro sounds perfect to me with very little change from my usual setup. A few wet-dry level tweaks on some instruments, but not much. One thing I did to stay true to the original cue was pan the harp to the right and vibraphone to the left, as this seems to be a thing that was done back then. I also dragged all of my muted brass closer to the main mics. Those old Star Trek scores are dry and personal, which is an aesthetic I've always liked. Hopefully I didn't betray Fred Steiner, but I also added just a couple of percussion instruments for a little more impact on a few notes. For instance, I added some tubular bells, tam-tam, and a snare roll right here for this big crescendo. This was another one of those moments where you try to stay true to the spirit of the original, but also ask yourself if maybe this embellishment helps the piece out in a small, unobtrusive way. So let's listen to this thing all the way through. Here it is. So there it is. That's my version of the Corbomite Maneuver Radiation Cue by Fred Steiner. I'm Carl King, and I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough. Be sure to check out more videos by Vienna Symphonic Library, and I'll see you next time.